Hi, my name is Alissa Voth. As Linda said, I am a PhD student at Northwestern University, and I am here to present on an ongoing project that I've been working on that is based on composition games. So the framework of this project came from my experiences teaching students with disabilities in Boston, especially my understanding of UDL, or the Universal Design for Learning. I don't know, are people here familiar with UDL? No, okay, so real basically it's a way of, it's much more than a learning theory, it's a design theory that is present in many, many different studies or fields of studies, but it is a way of removing barriers from education and learning by creating variations and multiple means of expression. So specifically, I was focusing on the multiple means of expression and how students could express musical goals. So for example, when I started teaching at this school, the students with disabilities had not been allowed to play guitar because it was unsafe. And so the first thing I did, I was like, well, it's not unsafe for all the students. So first of all, let's allow the students who can hold the guitar safely to hold the guitar safely. Oh, well, their hands, they don't have the fine motor skills to make chords. Cool, tune it to D. And then, well, this student, it's still unsafe because of the strings and the way that this student is handling the strings. Okay, let's cut the strings off the guitar and they can practice holding it safely. So it's a way of, it's for maximum inclusion. Through this framework, I began to ask a lot of broader questions. This here is a composition project I did while we were learning virtually. And it was specifically designed for the nonverbal students I had. A lot of the students, or the majority of the students I was working with are autistic. So this was a way for them to express melody, rhythm, and harmony using either, solfege hands or even just holding up finger numbers. It's not perfect, but it worked. And through Zoom, we were able, I could ask a student, should we use a whole note next, or would you like a half note? And then, a student could hold up two. And we're like, great. So even though a student isn't able to verbalize what they want musically, it doesn't mean that they're not musical. And this began to broaden my understanding of what it means for humans, the human instinct of music, beyond the label of composer, beyond the label of, musical people. And it made me question, who do we allow to make their own music? Kind of the conclusion that I have come to is that the idea that only a few people have this hyper ability to compose is really like a socially prescribed disability that we put onto others. Most people, I believe, are capable of making their own music. We just have to allow a different way of expressing that. From this, while this was all swimming in my head, this is a dear friend of mine, Paige Gully. They are a programmer and a computer scientist living in Massachusetts. And we found that we had a lot of common interest beyond our different goals. So they are also a musician, untrained. They're very active in the DIY and punk music in Boston and Western Mass. They're very cool. But they are really interested in AI learning and the social impact of that. And so where we found common ground was creating programs that can simulate underlying processes of learning, things that aren't necessarily apparent, but perhaps always under the surface, and from a framework of inclusion and expansion. Where I found myself relating to Paige is that at the time I was at Northwestern learning a lot about music cognition, learning a lot about theories of how we unconsciously organize sound and create our own understanding of musical form, musical satisfaction, closure, and openness. Somebody, Joseph Soa, mentioned the the David Huron Sweet Anticipation book. One of the games is based on his definition of, or his representation of post-skip reversals, which is, it's very fascinating. And I thought that it represented an interesting thing to represent because it removed a barrier of people who know music theory and people who don't. And through sort of this shared unknowing, if you will, musicians and non-musicians could play a game together. So what I don't have to share with you guys is a lot of UI final results of the games. Unfortunately, I don't know how practical this will be, but I wanted to share the process. So this is the first game that I thought of and that we tested. So it's on a tongue drum. The thing about the tongue drum is that the pitches are not, that you play around the drum are not, they're not on a linear scale. It's kind of tricky to, unless you're very familiar with the instrument, it's not very intuitive where the pitches are. So for most musicians who might maybe look at a guitar or a piano or a string instrument and can kind of piece things together, this is a little more mystified. And then the theory that I'm working on, and I have right down here at the bottom, a citation, is by a theorist named Steve Larson. This is from an amazing book, Musical Forces, Motion, Metaphor, and Meaning in Music. And he has this way of describing melodic pitch, I guess I should say pitch openness and closure through two theories called magnetism and gravity. Magnetism essentially saying that some pitches within, this is mostly talking about tonal structure, so that's one caveat. Some pitches are magnetically drawn into other pitches for closure. The idea of gravity, it's actually a shared thing when it comes to post-skip reversal, is the idea that what goes up comes down, which is a general shape that you might teach to a student who's learning how to write a melody. And then more specifically, how it centers around, it goes up and it lands on a lower organizing pitch. So in simplest form, that could be do. Here are the rules that are represented. I wanted to share them first because from a room of people who are, incredibly knowledgeable about theory, I hope that you don't understand what's going on. I barely know what's going on when I look at it, but this is a representation of the relatedness of these pitches and the underlying expectation that we have. Another way I could put this is that this is a game about paths of least resistance. It's not necessarily a game about how to make the best melody, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But now I'll give you the pitches or the solfege around the drum. So what you can see is essentially you start at any one of those, and then there's a series of rules. Let's say that you start on fa. You will then have to be drawn into mi. From mi, you can either go to the green square, which is a higher do, and then the end on the blue square, which is the lower do. If you, for example, started on do, the green square, you only have one option, you have to go to the blue square. I'll just play some examples of both of those particularly. So that would have been a red circle into a red triangle, into a green square, into a blue square. And then this would be a different example, a real short game outcome, which is just a green square to a blue square. I tested this out on a friend who was not a trained musician, someone who kind of played mandolin informally, and I tested this out on a lot of friends. And they learned the rules. It's tricky at first. It's easier to internalize after like a few minutes of being like, wait, what? And then once they internalized it, they began messing around with it. And, because they're a friend, I was like, stop it. Like, that's not what I'm testing. Like, that's not what Steve Larson wants. And then they were like, I don't care what Steve Larson wants, and started playing it around. And it was a huge epiphany for me where I was like, oh, that's their creative self coming through. Now that you have this rule internalized of how the pitch is structured through this instrument, the way that you break the rules are actually what's most interesting, and actually is your way of expressing your own individual desire for the pitch content here. So by breaking the rules, we are allowing players to decide how they will deviate from the game, allowing individual and creative outcomes. Non-musician participants are given an opportunity to create their own material, caveat, within a very limited framework. And it also makes the outcome of the game more satisfying, because now you have this resistance to the path of least resistance, and the closure of the phrase is more interesting. So here's a few examples of breaking the rules. So I would have to look at the drum again to know exactly what I did, but I think I went from triangle to triangle, then resolved it to the blue, to the blue square, something like that. It's hard to remember all of these things. It's meant to be mystifying, I'll say, but it's just breaking a couple of the rules, and it sounds a lot more interesting than the other examples. Here's just one more. So that is a string of closures. You have fa, mi, la, so, fa, mi, do. And after creating a bunch of these games, we decided we needed to test it. Like I said, my friend Paige, who is the software programmer, is very involved in the DIY and punk scene. So their partner actually was creating a music festival in like the woods of Massachusetts in February. It was wonderful. So we thought this is the perfect opportunity to try this out. So what we did was we filled a room with 5 different games. One of the games also being a sound scavenger hunt, where we gave them prompts and then actually gave them a map of the woods that we were in and sent them out to record field recordings, essentially, that were then later used. That was all the scratching noises you heard when I was testing the sound. So the games were played, again, like going back to my my experience teaching disabled students. It was really important to me that the participants touched and played instruments, which for them might have been something they didn't feel they were allowed to do, and were very intimidated, and could use a game as a way to break that barrier. And so there were games, there was the tongue drum. I made a very, very basic synth on Mac's MSP that they actually played. I put something over my laptop, and there's a bunch of arrows, and different sound combinations were triggered by the QWERTY keyboard. There was an electric guitar with some really beautiful reverb. We have this like 80s Casio tone with a lot of like fun, cheesy, and really beautiful synth sounds, and also their voice. So we had around 30 participants who were mostly non-musicians. I kind of like was recruiting people who were in the audience and not necessarily the people performing. And we had 211 audio files recorded. The way that we did this was, very fortunately, I have a friend who can figure this out. But they created a recording interface that could be accessed through QR codes at each game. I'll log out just so I can show you what a participant would first see. For data privacy laws in the United States, there has to be a consent before you can take anybody's recordings. So, I have to log in as a user. And then there's an additional consent that their recordings can be uploaded to a different site. They can also remain anonymous and share their recordings. And then from here, we have the different games. I'll do Game 3, the scavenger hunt. I'm going to block my microphone, but what you would do is you allow your microphone, and then you can hit record. What was, especially with the scavenger hunt, something that was really interesting was that the recording time is set. They don't get to stop the recording. So something that was important to us for the scavenger hunt was that it lasts an entire minute. I had a story from a participant who, I think it was for scratching. They went out, they took a hike, and they found a big chunk of ice. And so they started scratching the ice and recording it. And about like 10 seconds, they were like, okay, I'm done. And then they looked down and realized that there was still 50 seconds to go. And they came to me and was like, that was incredible. Like I had never experienced like sitting and just listening to something for so long. You know, a lot of my inspiration for this also came from Pauline Oliveros and deep listening and, you know, increasing your awareness of all of the sounds in our ecosystem that we tend to block out and not prioritize. Then they can play. If they don't like what they hear, hit record again, it records over. Once they are happy with what they've recorded, they can hit upload. And from there, this is what the QR code is. This is a final generative game that is built on the database of all of the audio files. We hope to make more of these, but it takes a lot of time, and me and Paige are both grad students. So, but anyways, you can see all of the different games here. So I'll just show you. You can set the time of the loop. So most of these are only 10 seconds long, or the default is set to the amount of recording time. So if I wanted to, I can, you know, triple the time. So it'll play the 10 seconds, and then you'll have 20 of silence. Because it was recorded on iPhone, some things are unpredictable. And then now you see there's silence. So then let's say that I wanted to add the tongue drum, but I want that to go just in a continuous loop. And let's say I want this one to be
push that
the entire minute.
Forward somehow from vertical.
The other artifact of this experience was that because it was in one room, there was a lot of sound pollution, I guess you could say. It actually made it way cooler. Anyways, this is actually Paige playing with the final generative game for like 20 minutes, but I just wanted to play it so you could get an idea of the sounds of it. It can get quite loud, so I'll be careful. It's like about 20 minutes long. If you want to listen to the whole thing, it's very relaxing and ambient, but I'll just play a few little excerpts from it. Somebody I think what they did is they like scraped one of the cymbals that was just around. Gnarly sound. Get ready. Okay, now we'll go back to some of the nicer sounds. All right, right, so that's a general experience of what the piece was like. We got some feedback from participants that a few people said that they just like to play with it and just keep it looping in the background, sort of as like a white noise ambient sound. And yeah, from there, we got really excited about this project. We had a lot of really positive feedback, people saying that they had fun, that they felt like they learned something, that they felt like they were able to listen in a different way than they had before. And so we really want and are moving forward with this project. We have a lot of questions that we're also asking ourselves with it, like what kind of learning are we expecting a participant to do? What importance is it that the game structures are transparent? Are we teaching people about music cognition, or is there supposed to be just sort of a magical shroud over the whole thing? And then we have decided that we are moving this to a virtual space for practicality and also for reasons of access. I would prefer, of course, that people can play on physical instruments, but it's very difficult to find a space for that, and it's very difficult to be able to get the funds to set those things up. So for an example, here's something, this is, not done by any means, but wanted to just show sort of what we're doing. So this is building a chord tree. So what you have is a open to close harmonic, diatonic harmonic phrase. So you can, you click on C, and then you're able to choose a different chord. So I'm going to choose F, and then I can play the sequence. Sometimes it does that the first time you play it. And then I can say, okay, nice, I want it to be longer, so I will click on F. Let's see, maybe I'll do A minor, I'll click on C. Maybe I'll try E minor. Okay, let's play the sequence. Maybe I'm like, this chord right here is kind of weird, I don't know why. Maybe I'll do something different. Maybe I'll just do A minor again, and then what I'll do is I'll mute this one. And then I'm like, oh, that's something, I really like that. Something about that feels really good. Then you could upload that into another generative game. This has been really exciting for my friend Paige. I suppose that there's a lot of conversation right now in the computer sciences about collaboration and responsibility in working with larger tech industries. So Paige and I wrote a summary of our experience with the festival sound installation, and we got published in a journal called SIGCAS, which is Special Interest Groups in Computers and Society. We were able to talk about, especially just like DIY social media for smaller communities. Through that, we also began to think about how this thing that we're creating it's a form of social media, and it's also a use of social media as an instrument, a large collaborative instrument and a group composition. So we're both equally excited about the opportunity, and hope to be able to present it in a better browser and virtual form probably in the next 2 years. Anyways, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I am the only one who does game music. I know I'm absolutely not. So I also just wanted to provide resources for 2 other composers who are making excellent educational composition games that might even be a little more practical than what I shared today. Brian Ellis, I believe he lives in New York. I actually just met him for the first time a month or 2 ago. He is also a tech person. I'm not gonna say, okay, I am questioning how much I actually know about what he does, so I'm not gonna say it. But he works for tech companies, and he is also a composer. He recently worked with Third Coast Percussion in Chicago. And he does lots of tech-based sound installation games, apps that people can put on their phones and move around, and it's motion detected, and then there's a whole group of them. Danny Clay is in California, I believe San Francisco, and he works with kids and sort of like sound exploration and exploration of notation. He also has been making sort of puzzle games that could be played on a computer, the type of, like the sandbox type of model where there's different things that you can click on and move around. So I just also wanted to provide a little extra information on some people. But anyways, thank you so much.
Time for a question or two. Anybody has?
Hey, still Jimmy. You talked at the beginning about how universal design principles were influencing some of that work. I was just wondering if you could speak a little to how that experience has informed the kinds of things you've set up for Ludens and how that work has continued. Yeah,
I'll say what I think we're doing well, and then I'll say what we're really not doing well right now because it's in development. So what we're focusing right now is the idea of representation, which is how a student, or maybe in this case more just like a person, is able to represent their understanding of something beyond just traditional means, or to provide multiple variations of how that could be. So we see a game outcome, breaking the rules. We see using the virtual instrument. These are all ways that a person can express their musicality, removed from barriers of needing to understand music theory or needing any sort of formal training, of access to physical instruments, of access to other forms of teaching. There's, not everybody can be a composer. That's just reality of what is accessible to people. But I believe everybody can be a music maker. And I believe that everybody instinctively is a music maker, but there is a social barrier that we experience. There was conversations about the creative genius, and how at a certain age that is just, squashed. I don't know. I would hope to press against that a little bit and be maybe that creativity isn't lost, but maybe it's just not used, and maybe it can be gained. But we are specifically trying to allow adults who would say, I am unmusical, I don't have a musical bone in my body, to represent some sort of musicality. What we're not doing well, why I said that I'm not really confident in showing a lot of UI right now. We're not the engagement of the work right now. It's mostly text-based because that was another reason we wanted to move it virtual. It's a lot easier for somebody to just press a button and then be given a set of choices versus having to read a set of rules and then learn it and then contextualize it. That just, that is a huge barrier to a lot of different types of people. So that is another reason we're moving towards a virtual version of the games.
Very quickly. First of all, amazing work. Thank you for doing it.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. Very specific questions. You mentioned your work with autistic children. I'm just curious kind of what setting that was in. And then I also want to ask if you've worked with any music therapists through this project. And if not, I think this would be really useful in that field. So.
Yeah, thank you. So I will say this, to my knowledge, I don't know that any of the adults who use this are autistic. That's just not something we asked. I used to work in Boston Public Schools as a music teacher, teaching artist for a student with disabilities program. And through that, most of the students I was working with were autistic or Down syndrome or, different cognitive abilities that, the school thought that they would not be in the best environment if they were in the normal music class. So a lot of the work I did there was trying just to represent their musicality, trying to just allow them to make music. And if it sounds horrible to their teachers, I'm sorry, you know. They're doing what makes them human and what makes them feel good and what makes them express themselves, and the idea of how a person should be musical. It really shaped my view of that. And the second question. So while I was working in Boston, I also went to the Boston Conservatory, which is merged with Berklee. So Berklee has a music therapy program, and then there was also a music therapist who would come to the high school and work individually with one student. So she and I would meet a few times. I would be able to sit in her meetings with the student. And I ended up using a lot of what I saw from her. But the difference that I definitely see between inclusive composition or inclusive teaching and music theory is using music to achieve some sort of intervention, where inclusive learning is really just teaching a person to be more musical. But I mean, that would be super cool. I don't know, I've never shared this with a music therapist, but I would love to at some point, yeah.
Thank you so much.